The room was almost empty by the time Elvis Presley noticed him. A few folding chairs remained scattered across the church fellowship hall. Paper cups sat half-finished near the edges of long tables. Somebody in the kitchen was still rinsing dishes. The noise from earlier in the evening, the laughter, the handshakes, the constant movement around Elvis had already begun fading into that strange silence that only comes after crowds leave. For most people there, the night was over. But near the far wall, beneath a dim overhead light, one man was still sitting alone beside an old upright piano. He looked tired, older than Elvis remembered, his shoulders slightly folded inward, his hands resting quietly on a cane placed between his knees. A few people walked past him without stopping. Nobody seemed rude exactly. They just seemed distracted, the way people often become around someone who no longer belongs to the center of the room. Then Elvis stopped walking. Not dramatically, not in a way that pulled attention toward himself. In fact, several people near him kept talking before realizing Elvis was no longer moving beside them. Because Elvis was staring at the man near the piano. And for a second, the years between them seemed to disappear. Long before Las Vegas, before Hollywood contracts, before Graceland tours and sold-out arenas and bodyguards and cameras following him through parking lots, before the white jumpsuits became part of American mythology, before the world turned Elvis Presley into something larger than a human being. There had been church halls like this one. Small rooms, humid summers, folding chairs that squeaked against wooden floors, gospel music echoing against plain walls, the smell of coffee and old hymn books, and somewhere nearby, usually behind a piano worn down by decades of Sunday mornings, there had often been men exactly like this one. Quiet musicians, the kind history rarely remembers.
Elvis looked at him for another moment before finally speaking. "Brother Keisker." Accounts differ on certain details surrounding moments like this throughout Elvis's life, and some memories from people present years later do not perfectly align. But what is consistently documented by those who knew Elvis well is this: he rarely forgot the people connected to gospel music and the churches that shaped him early on, especially musicians, especially pianists, especially the ones who were there before fame complicated everything. The old man slowly looked up. And when he recognized Elvis, something changed in his face. Not shock exactly, but disbelief mixed with recognition, as if two completely different versions of America had suddenly collided in one quiet room. Because the man sitting beside that piano had not known Elvis Presley. Not really. He had known Elvis before the world claimed him, before security guards separated him from ordinary spaces, before fans screamed so loudly nobody could hear silence around him anymore. And maybe that was part of why Elvis kept staring at him longer than anyone expected. People often talked about Elvis's generosity during the 1970s, the cars, the checks, the gifts handed to strangers. Over time, those stories became so large they almost turned mythical, as if generosity itself had become part of the Elvis legend. But people close to him sometimes described something quieter underneath those moments, a man increasingly haunted by memory, loyalty, and the uncomfortable feeling that fame had pulled him away from the world that once felt emotionally real to him. Church was part of that world. Not simply religion in the formal sense, something deeper than that. Music, community, recognition without performance. Before RCA Records, before Colonel Tom Parker began reshaping Elvis into a global phenomenon, before the endless pressure to remain Elvis Presley every hour of the day. Gospel music had given him something stable,
Something emotionally safe, and the musicians around those churches had helped create that foundation, whether history remembered their names or not. Now one of them was sitting alone in front of him. Elvis finally walked across the room. Not quickly, almost carefully. The people near him lowered their voices. A few stopped talking altogether. Because even after years of public appearances, Elvis still had moments where the atmosphere around him changed simply through body language alone, and this was one of them. The old pianist tried to stand. Elvis immediately motioned for him not to. Then Elvis pulled out the chair beside him and sat down. No cameras moved closer, no speech was given, no performance began.
just two men sitting near an old piano while the room slowly emptied around them. And for the first time that evening, Elvis looked genuinely relaxed. Not the public smile, not the carefully controlled charm audiences expected. Something else, something quieter. People nearby could not hear every word exchanged between them, and later recollections vary, but several remembered the same general feeling. Elvis was no longer speaking like a celebrity meeting a fan. He was speaking like someone returning briefly to a version of himself he rarely got to visit anymore. The pianist asked Elvis if he still played gospel late at night. Elvis smiled slightly at that, because the truthful answer was yes. Even during the years when his public image became increasingly connected to spectacle, the jumpsuits, the concert entrances, the celebrity lifestyle, people close to Elvis repeatedly described late-night gospel sessions behind closed doors, sometimes after shows, sometimes at Graceland, sometimes deep into the morning while much of the world imagined Elvis living entirely inside excess and performance. But gospel music remained. It survived every reinvention. And maybe that was why this conversation mattered more than people in the room understood at the time.
The pianist's hands rested near the piano keys for a moment, though he did not play. Age had slowed him. Years had changed him physically. Elvis noticed that immediately. He also noticed something else. The man's suit was old, carefully maintained but old, the cuffs slightly worn, the shoes polished longer than they probably should have lasted. Details most people overlook. Elvis rarely did, especially with people from his earlier life, especially with working musicians. A silence settled between them briefly, not uncomfortable silence, the kind shared by people carrying memory neither needs to explain completely. Then the pianist quietly admitted something that shifted the mood of the conversation. He told Elvis he had almost not come that night at all, and suddenly the meeting stopped feeling accidental. The old pianist looked down at the floor after saying it. For a moment, he seemed almost embarrassed by the admission, as if he regretted allowing the thought to leave his mouth at all. Elvis stayed quiet. He had always understood something most people around fame eventually forget. Silence often tells you more than conversation does. The room around them had grown nearly still now. Somewhere in another part of the building, a door closed softly. A volunteer pushed chairs together across the floor with slow scraping sounds. But near the piano, time felt strangely suspended. The pianist finally explained that he had not been sure anyone would remember him anymore. Not the church people, not the younger musicians, certainly not Elvis Presley. And that sentence landed harder than anyone nearby realized, because forgetting was something Elvis understood better than the public ever imagined. The world remembered Elvis constantly. That was part of the burden. His face, his voice, his image, all frozen permanently in public memory. But the people from before the fame often disappeared quietly into ordinary life, while the legend kept expanding around him.
Church pianists, choir directors, backup singers, local musicians, men who spent decades behind instruments, while someone else became immortal under stage lights. Elvis looked back toward the old upright piano beside them. Even now, after everything, gospel music still affected him differently than any other kind of music ever had. People close to Elvis described this repeatedly throughout his life. He could move through Hollywood meetings, concert tours, movie contracts, and endless business negotiations with visible exhaustion. But gospel sessions often changed his entire mood. Something about that music reached the part of him fame never fully replaced. And those roots stretched back farther than most fans understood. Long before Graceland became a symbol recognized around the world, Elvis's life revolved around small churches, cramped rooms, and gospel harmonies carried through southern heat. Tupelo had been poor. Memphis had not magically solved that poverty overnight. The Presley family knew instability intimately during Elvis's early years. Cheap apartments, temporary jobs, constant movement, financial uncertainty hanging over daily life. In those environments, church was not simply ritual, it was structure, community, escape. Music became emotional oxygen there. Not polished, not commercial, real. Human voices pressed together inside small rooms where nobody cared about celebrity because nobody expected it to exist nearby. Elvis absorbed all of it. Black gospel quartets,
Southern church pianists, country hymns, spirituals filled with exhaustion and hope at the same time. Historians and musicians alike have documented how deeply gospel shaped Elvis's phrasing, emotional rhythm, and musical instincts long before commercial success arrived. But what mattered in moments like this was not technical influence, it was emotional memory. The pianist sitting beside him represented a world untouched by performance mythology.
A world where Elvis was still simply Gladys Presley's shy son, sitting in church listening carefully to musicians older and steadier than himself. The pianist smiled faintly and asked Elvis if he remembered the old Sunday night services that sometimes stretched for hours in summer heat. Elvis laughed softly under his breath at that, because he remembered all of it. The packed rooms, the fans turning slowly overhead, the sweat soaking through shirts before the singing even properly started. The way musicians sometimes kept playing after formal service ended because nobody wanted the night to finish yet. Fame had given Elvis enormous houses, airplanes, jewelry, security teams, and international recognition. But moments like this revealed something uncomfortable underneath the legend. Some of his strongest emotional memories still came from rooms where almost nobody had money. The pianist told Elvis that he used to watch him carefully during those church services, not because he predicted stardom, nobody truly did, but because even as a teenager, Elvis listened differently than most young people around him. He watched musicians intensely. He studied timing, rhythm, emotion. He cared about how songs made people feel physically inside a room. Not everybody understood that at the time. Years later, critics would debate Elvis endlessly. His fame, his influence, his image, the controversies surrounding his career. But the musicians who encountered him early often described something simpler first: attention. Elvis paid attention to music obsessively. The pianist paused again before quietly admitting something else. He said there were nights back then when Elvis stayed after church longer than everyone else just to sit near the piano and listen. Not perform, not talk much, just listen. That detail stayed hanging quietly between them. Because even now, surrounded by fame and expectation, Elvis still looked most comfortable near musicians who treated music as something spiritual rather than commercial. The public version of Elvis by the 1970s had become almost impossibly large. Concert entrances designed like royal appearances, crowds screaming before he even reached the microphone, reporters analyzing his weight, his health, his spending, his private life, every movement magnified into national conversation. But sitting beside that old pianist, another version of Elvis briefly surfaced, the boy who once measured rooms by sound instead of applause. And maybe that was why Elvis suddenly asked the question nobody nearby expected him to ask. He asked the pianist if he was still playing regularly anywhere. The older man hesitated before answering. Then he admitted the truth quietly. Not much anymore. Churches changed, younger musicians came in. His hands were not as steady as they once were. Some nights the pain in his fingers became difficult to ignore entirely. He tried to say it casually, like age was simply doing what age always does. But Elvis noticed the hesitation underneath the words. He noticed the carefulness, the attempt to protect dignity, and the atmosphere around the conversation shifted again. Because now the meeting was no longer simply nostalgic. Something heavier had entered the room. Elvis leaned back slightly in his chair and looked again at the piano keys. Many of them were faded from decades of use, some chipped near the edges, an old instrument that had survived long enough to become almost invisible to people passing by. The comparison sitting quietly beneath the moment was impossible to ignore. One man had become one of the most recognized entertainers on earth. The other had spent much of his life helping build music inside small churches where history rarely looked twice. Yet somehow both men had arrived at the same room, carrying different versions of loneliness. The pianist finally admitted why he had nearly stayed home that night. He said he had heard Elvis might appear, but he did not want to embarrass himself by approaching him after all these years. He figured Elvis probably met thousands of people now, thousands of faces, thousands of hands, thousands of memories impossible to sort through anymore. Elvis stared at him for a long moment after hearing that.
Then he quietly shook his head, and what he said next changed the entire feeling of the night. Elvis leaned forward slowly, his elbows resting against his knees, his eyes fixed on the worn piano keys between them. The room had grown quieter now. Most people had already left the fellowship hall, and the few still cleaning nearby had started pretending not to watch, because something about the conversation felt personal in a way celebrity encounters almost never do. Elvis finally answered the pianist in a voice low enough that people closest to them could barely hear it. He told the old man that fame had made him meet millions of faces, but very few people still reminded him of who he had been before all of it started. The pianist looked down immediately after hearing that, almost as if the weight of the sentence embarrassed him. Elvis noticed. He always noticed discomfort in other people faster than he admitted publicly. That sensitivity had followed him his entire life. People often misunderstood it because the public version of Elvis eventually became so oversized. The jewelry, the stage entrances, the bodyguards, the mythology surrounding Graceland itself. But beneath that image, many who worked closely with him described a man unusually alert to loneliness, especially in older people, musicians, church workers, and those who seemed quietly forgotten by the world around them. The pianist tried changing the subject. He asked Elvis whether he still traveled as much as the newspapers claimed. Elvis smiled faintly at that question, but it was not a happy smile.
By this point in his life, travel no longer represented freedom, it represented obligation. Hotels blurred together, airports blurred together, concerts sometimes blurred together. The crowds remained enormous, but the isolation inside that fame had become harder to hide during the later years. Even people close to Elvis acknowledged that exhaustion increasingly followed him everywhere. Yet sitting beside that piano, some of that visible tension had briefly disappeared. The pianist slowly rested his fingers against the keys without fully pressing them down. His hands trembled slightly from age, arthritis most likely. Years of playing had stiffened the joints. Elvis watched carefully. Then he quietly asked if the pain made it difficult to play now. The old man nodded once. No dramatics, no self-pity, just honesty. He admitted there were mornings when even buttoning his shirt became frustrating. But he missed the piano most. Not performance, not attention, just the feeling of music moving naturally through his hands. Elvis lowered his eyes toward the floor for a moment after hearing that. Accounts from people around him throughout the 1970s repeatedly describe how emotionally affected Elvis could become when conversations turned toward aging, physical decline, or lost purpose. Part of that likely came from his own growing awareness of exhaustion inside himself. The public still saw the superstar entering arenas beneath bright lights, but privately, his body had already begun struggling under enormous pressure. Prescription medications, insomnia, relentless touring schedules, emotional isolation, and years of physical wear hidden beneath performance routines. Maybe that was why the pianist's words landed so deeply, because for all the obvious differences between them, both men understood what it felt like when the thing that once defined your identity became harder to hold on to. A long silence settled again. Somewhere outside the building, a car engine started.
The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly. Elvis reached out absent-mindedly and touched one of the piano keys himself. The note rang quietly through the nearly empty hall. Then another. Not a melody yet, just sound. The pianist looked over at him carefully, and for the first time that night, a genuine smile crossed his face. He told Elvis the touch was still there. Elvis laughed softly under his breath at that. "Sometimes," he replied. The old pianist shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "it's still there." What made moments like this emotionally powerful was not spectacle. It was restraint. Nobody was performing for cameras. Nobody was trying to create history. Two men were simply sitting in a church hall late at night, talking about music, memory, and time passing faster than either of them wanted to admit. And then the pianist revealed something Elvis had not known. He quietly explained that his wife had passed away the previous winter. The words changed the atmosphere immediately. Elvis stopped touching the piano keys. The older man kept speaking carefully, almost apologetically, explaining that after her death he rarely came out much anymore. Church had become difficult. Music had become difficult. Even sitting near the piano sometimes felt painful because too many memories arrived all at once. Elvis listened without interrupting. People close to him often described the side of his personality. When conversations became genuinely emotional, he sometimes grew unusually still, as though instinctively understanding that silence could be more respectful than filling space with comforting phrases. The pianist admitted that earlier that evening he had almost turned his car around before coming inside. He was tired, grieving,
embarrassed by how much older he felt lately. But he missed hearing live gospel music around other people, even if only for one night. Elvis looked at him for several seconds before asking a simple question. "You been eating all right?"
The pianist looked surprised by it, because it was not celebrity small talk. It was the kind of question asked by somebody noticing details others ignored. The hesitation before the answer told Elvis enough. Money problems were not stated directly at first. They did not need to be. The worn suit, the careful language, the embarrassment around accepting help. Elvis had seen versions of this before, especially among older musicians whose lives never translated into financial security. Fame often made audiences assume everyone connected to music lived comfortably. The reality was usually far less glamorous. The pianist finally admitted that medical bills had become difficult after his wife's illness. Some weeks were manageable, others were not. He tried smiling while saying it, but exhaustion sat visibly underneath the expression. Elvis leaned back slowly in his chair. His face changed then, not dramatically, but the relaxed nostalgia from earlier disappeared beneath something heavier. Because this conversation had stopped being about the past entirely. Now it was about what happened to people after the world stopped noticing them. The old man quickly added that he was not asking for anything. That mattered deeply to him. Pride still existed there. Dignity still existed there. Elvis nodded immediately, almost before the sentence finished. Then he looked around the emptying hall once more before quietly standing to his feet. The pianist looked confused at first, watching Elvis walk several steps away toward two members of his entourage standing near the exit. The conversation between them remained private, spoken low enough that nobody nearby could fully hear it. But the expressions on their faces shifted quickly from casual attention to serious understanding. One of the men nodded immediately and disappeared down the hallway.
Elvis remained standing there for a moment, with his hands resting against his belt, staring absently toward the fellowship hall floor, as though thinking through something larger than money alone. Then he walked back toward the piano and sat beside the old man again. But now the atmosphere had changed completely, because the pianist suddenly realized Elvis had not walked away from the conversation. He had stepped deeper into it. When Elvis sat back down beside the pianist, the room felt smaller somehow, more intimate. The noise from earlier in the evening had disappeared almost completely now, leaving only the low hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional distant movement from volunteers cleaning the building before locking up for the night. The pianist looked at Elvis carefully, as though trying to understand what had just happened across the room. Elvis did not explain it immediately. Instead, he rested one arm across the back of the empty chair beside him and asked another question about the old church days in Memphis. On the surface, it sounded casual, but it also gave the pianist something important: time to recover his composure. That mattered to Elvis. People often focused on the gifts, the checks, the expensive gestures that became part of his public reputation. But individuals close to him sometimes described another pattern beneath those moments. Elvis usually tried to protect people from feeling exposed while helping them, especially older people, especially proud people, especially those connected to music and church life. The pianist slowly smiled while remembering one particular service from years earlier, when the church air conditioning had failed during the middle of summer. He recalled sweat dripping from the walls, women fanning themselves with folded church programs, and a teenage Elvis singing louder as the room grew hotter instead of quieter. Elvis laughed immediately at the memory. A real laugh this time. Brief, but genuine. For a moment, the exhaustion that had settled into his face during later years seemed to lift slightly, and that contrast mattered. Because by the mid-1970s, much of the public conversation surrounding Elvis centered on spectacle or decline. Tabloids focused on his appearance, his health, his spending habits, his increasingly unpredictable image. The humanity underneath the icon often became harder for outsiders to see. Yet moments like this revealed a different emotional reality entirely. Elvis did not seem most alive while discussing fame. He came alive discussing memory, gospel music, old rooms, small details nobody else still cared about. The pianist noticed it too. He quietly told Elvis that despite everything the world now said about him, he still sounded exactly like the same young man who used to stay after church talking about songs long after everyone else went home. Elvis lowered his eyes after hearing that. Compliments about fame rarely affected him deeply anymore.
but recognition tied to who he had been before celebrity still reached him in ways success often could not. The truth was more complicated than the public image allowed. Elvis loved admiration. He loved making people happy. He loved generosity. But fame also trapped him inside permanent performance. Every entrance became an event. Every public appearance carried expectation. Every room changed when he walked into it. Over time, that kind of existence can distort ordinary human connection. The Pianist represented something extraordinarily rare by that stage of Elvis's life. Somebody emotionally untouched by the machinery surrounding Elvis Presley. Somebody who remembered him before the world turned him into a symbol. That was difficult to replace once lost. A few minutes later, one of Elvis's associates quietly returned to the fellowship hall carrying a plain envelope. He approached carefully, not wanting to interrupt the conversation. Elvis took the envelope discreetly without opening it.
No announcement followed. No dramatic reveal. The pianist seemed confused at first, until Elvis gently placed the envelope near the edge of the piano beside him. Immediately, the older man shook his head. His reaction came fast, almost instinctive. Pride again, embarrassment again. He started trying to refuse before Elvis interrupted him softly. Nobody nearby could hear every word exchanged between them, and later recollections differ in small details. But accounts consistently describe Elvis speaking calmly and directly, not like a celebrity performing generosity, but like a man unwilling to let someone from his past carry unnecessary humiliation alone. The important thing was not simply the money itself, it was the way Elvis handled the moment. Quietly, privately, without turning another person's hardship into public theater. That distinction says something important about him, because over the years, countless stories surrounding Elvis's generosity became exaggerated into mythology. Cars handed away overnight, jewelry gifted impulsively, huge financial gestures repeated until they almost sounded fictional. Some stories were true, some became inflated over time, but the emotional core beneath many of them remained remarkably consistent. Elvis seemed deeply affected by people who appeared forgotten, overwhelmed, aging, grieving, or quietly struggling beneath dignity they were trying hard to maintain. Maybe part of that came from his own fear of isolation. Maybe part came from his mother's influence. Maybe part came from growing up around poverty severe enough that small humiliations left permanent emotional marks. More likely, it came from all of those things combined. The pianist finally stopped trying to refuse the envelope, but his eyes stayed fixed on the piano instead of Elvis. Emotion had entered the room now, though neither man dramatized it openly. That restraint made the moment feel even heavier.
The pianist's voice had grown quieter when he finally admitted he did not know how to thank him. Elvis answered almost immediately, "You already did." The older man looked confused. Elvis motioned gently toward the piano, toward the church hall, toward memory itself. And suddenly the conversation no longer seemed centered on charity at all. It became about debt. Not financial debt, emotional debt. The kind people carry quietly across decades. Elvis understood something fame rarely teaches people. Nobody becomes who they are alone. Before stadiums and recordings and screaming crowds, there are usually ordinary people helping shape the emotional foundation underneath future success. Teachers, musicians, church workers, family friends. People history never fully records. Sitting beside that old pianist, Elvis seemed to recognize that reality more clearly than ever. The world remembered the superstar. Elvis remembered the rooms that built him first. Outside, rain had started falling softly against the church windows. The fellowship hall lights reflected faintly against the glass, while volunteers finished cleaning around them. The evening had stretched far later than anyone expected, yet Elvis showed no sign of wanting to leave, because something larger than nostalgia had taken hold of him now. The pianist quietly asked Elvis whether he still ever got lonely, despite all the people constantly surrounding him. The question hung in the air for several seconds. Most people around Elvis would never have dared ask it so directly, but this man came from a world before bodyguards and handlers and celebrity distance. Elvis looked down at his hands before answering. Then he gave a small shrug that seemed older than his years. "Sometimes the crowd makes it worse," he admitted quietly. The pianist nodded immediately, as though he understood the answer without needing further explanation. And perhaps he did, because loneliness does not always come from being physically alone. Sometimes it comes from feeling emotionally unreachable inside a life too large for ordinary connection anymore. That understanding passed silently between them, while rain continued tapping softly against the windows outside. Then Elvis looked back toward the piano once more and asked the question that changed the entire night yet again. He asked the pianist if he still remembered the old gospel song they used to play after late services, when almost everybody else had already gone home. The old pianist looked up slowly after Elvis asked the question. For a second, he seemed surprised that Elvis still remembered the song at all. Decades had passed since those late church services. Entire lifetimes had unfolded between then and now. America itself had changed. Music had changed. Elvis Presley had become one of the most recognized figures on earth. Yet somehow, beneath all of it, one quiet gospel melody had survived inside his memory, untouched. The pianist smiled faintly and nodded. "I remember," he said softly. Elvis rested his fingers against the piano keys again, this time with more certainty. The notes came slowly at first, careful, almost hesitant. He was not performing now. There was no stage voice, no arena power, no attempt to impress anyone left in the room. Just a tired man near midnight, playing fragments of a hymn tied to a version of himself the world rarely got to see anymore. The pianist quietly joined him after a moment. His hands moved slower than they once had, but the instinct remained. Years disappeared from the room little by little. Not literally. Age still sat visibly on both men. Exhaustion still existed. Loss still existed. But for a few brief minutes, fame stopped mattering entirely. What remained was music. Simple gospel chords filling a nearly empty church fellowship hall, while rain touched the windows outside. One volunteer near the kitchen later described the moment not as dramatic, but strangely peaceful. That distinction matters.
Because the truth about emotionally powerful moments is that they are often quieter than mythology wants them to be. No audience applause interrupted the music. No speeches followed. No grand revelations suddenly transformed the night into legend. And yet the emotional weight of the moment stayed with people who witnessed it, precisely because nothing about it felt performed. Elvis sang softly under his breath during parts of the hymn. Not every lyric, just pieces he still remembered instinctively. Gospel music had always occupied a different emotional place inside him than fame ever did. Friends, musicians, and family members described this repeatedly across different periods of his life. When Elvis returned to gospel music privately, the atmosphere around him often changed completely. The pressure lifted slightly. The performance instinct softened. The distance between the public icon and the private man narrowed for a little while. Sitting beside that old pianist, those walls seemed lower than usual. The song eventually faded naturally. Neither man rushed to fill the silence afterward. They simply sat there together, listening to the last notes disappear into the empty room. Then the pianist quietly admitted something that stayed with Elvis long after the night ended. He told him that for years he had worried fame might have erased the boy he once knew in church. Not morally, not spiritually, simply emotionally. He feared the machinery surrounding celebrity had become too large for old memories to survive inside it. Elvis stared at the piano keys for several seconds after hearing that. Then he answered with a sentence so quiet, only the pianist fully heard it. But the expression on the older man's face changed immediately afterward. His eyes filled slightly, not with shock, recognition, because whatever Elvis said, it carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent years trying not to lose himself beneath the weight of his own mythology. That tension existed throughout Elvis's later life. Publicly, he remained larger than culture itself in many ways. The clothes, the concerts, the voice, the iconography recognized instantly around the world. Privately, people close to him often described a man searching constantly for grounding forces, capable of cutting through fame's artificiality. Gospel music did that sometimes. Old friends occasionally did too. And people from before the superstardom carried a kind of emotional credibility impossible to fake. The pianist was one of those people. Eventually, the hour grew too late, even for memory to hold back time any longer. The remaining volunteers began shutting off lights in other parts of the building. Chairs had been stacked, coffee cups thrown away. Rain still drifted softly outside. Elvis stood slowly from the piano bench, and for the first time all evening, the exhaustion returned visibly to his posture. The pianist rose carefully, using his cane. For a moment, they simply faced each other quietly beneath the dim fellowship hall lights. Two aging men carrying entirely different versions of American life. One globally famous, one mostly forgotten outside small church circles, yet both marked by time in ways money could not fully protect anyone from. Elvis reached forward first and embraced him briefly. Not a celebrity embrace, not the quick public gesture cameras usually captured. Something smaller, personal. The pianist held on to him for an extra second before stepping back. Then Elvis did something subtle people nearby remembered years later. He looked directly at the old man before leaving and said, "Don't wait alone next time." The sentence sounded simple on the surface, but it carried far more than logistical meaning. Because the entire evening had quietly revolved around one painful reality. Aging often pushes people toward invisibility long before life actually ends. Musicians who once filled rooms with music become background figures.
Widowers returned home to empty houses. Church pianists retire unnoticed. Even global celebrities can become isolated inside crowds too enormous for genuine closeness. Elvis seemed to understand that loneliness more deeply than the public often realized. The pianist nodded silently after hearing the words. Elvis gave him one final look before turning toward the exit with his entourage waiting nearby. But just before leaving the fellowship hall completely, he stopped once more and looked back toward the piano, toward the old man standing beside it, toward the room where memory had briefly overpowered mythology. Then he walked out into the rain. Years later, stories surrounding Elvis Presley would continue growing larger than life, some true, some exaggerated, some transformed into folklore through repetition. But moments like this endure for a different reason entirely. Not because they proved Elvis was perfect, not because they fit neatly into celebrity mythology. They endure because they reveal something painfully human beneath the iconography. A man worshipped by millions, still searching for emotional honesty in the company of people who remembered him before the world demanded performance from him every hour of the day. And perhaps that is why the gesture meant more than money. Money could help with bills. It could relieve immediate hardship. But what Elvis gave that night reached deeper than financial relief. He gave recognition back to someone the world had slowly stopped seeing. He reminded an aging pianist that the music he once played inside small southern churches still mattered to somebody who carried those songs all the way into history. Long after the crowds disappeared, that may have been the part worth remembering most. In the years after Elvis Presley's death, countless stories continued circulating about his generosity. Some grew larger with retelling. Others became tangled somewhere between memory and myth. That happens with cultural figures of Elvis's size. Eventually, the man and the legend begin competing with each other inside public memory, but certain moments survive precisely because they feel too quiet to be invented for spectacle. This was one of them. No reporters built headlines around an aging church pianist sitting beside Elvis after midnight. No television cameras waited outside the fellowship hall doors. There was no audience left demanding a performance by the end of the evening. Just rain falling softly over Memphis, while two men carried fragments of the same past into a future neither fully understood. And maybe that mattered more than either realized at the time. Because by the later years of Elvis's life, almost every room he entered already contained expectations waiting for him. People wanted charisma, energy, the voice, the myth. Even kindness itself had become part of the Elvis Presley image. The public expected grand gestures from him. But expectations can slowly turn humanity into routine performance if a person is not careful. That was the difference with the pianist. Nothing about that meeting required performance. The old man did not approach Elvis as an icon. He approached him as somebody he remembered from before the white jumpsuits, before the movies, before the screaming crowds turned ordinary life impossible. And for Elvis, that kind of recognition had become increasingly rare. There is something quietly tragic about fame at that level. The larger the public image grows, the harder genuine memory becomes to find. People stop speaking to the person and start speaking to the symbol. Conversations become careful. Reactions become exaggerated. Rooms change before you even enter them. But memory does not behave that way.
Memory pulls everything back down to human scale. A church hallway, a tired piano, a familiar hymn, an older man waiting alone after everybody else leaves.
Those details mattered to Elvis because they belonged to a world untouched by celebrity machinery, a world where music still existed before business entered the room. And perhaps that was why gospel music remained emotionally sacred to him throughout his life. It connected him to the version of himself fame never fully erased. The pianist reportedly spoke about the meeting only sparingly afterward. People from that generation often did. Pride mattered to them. Privacy mattered too. But those who heard him describe the evening remembered the same detail repeatedly. He seemed less moved by the financial help than by the fact Elvis stayed. That was the part that lingered. He stayed. He listened. He remembered. For someone slowly disappearing into the edges of public life, that recognition carried enormous emotional weight. And in many ways, the moment revealed something important not only about Elvis, but about the strange loneliness hidden inside American celebrity culture itself. People often imagine fame as permanent connection. In reality, it can create extraordinary emotional distance. The crowds become larger while authentic closeness becomes rarer. Elvis understood that contradiction deeply by the final years of his life. So when he saw an aging pianist sitting quietly beside an old church piano, he likely recognized more than nostalgia. He recognized isolation. He recognized exhaustion. He recognized what happens when the world slowly moves its attention somewhere else. And perhaps, for one evening, he refused to let another person feel invisible inside that silence. The image remains powerful precisely because it is so restrained. Not a superstar on stage beneath blinding lights, not Elvis Presley, the global phenomenon, just a man sitting beside somebody who helped shape the emotional foundation beneath the legend long before history started watching. In the end, the moment was never really about money. It was about memory surviving fame. It was about dignity surviving age. And it was about one exhausted icon quietly reaching back toward the small church world that first taught him music could comfort lonely people long after the crowd goes home.